The footage is grainy, typical of courtroom cameras from the early 2000s, but the expression on the defendant's face is unmistakable. It is July 2004, inside the San Joaquin County Superior Court in Stockton, California. The young man sitting at the defense table is 17-year-old Marvel Weaver. He is slight, youthful, dressed in the standard-issue jail clothing that usually swallows the frame of a teenager, making them look small and vulnerable against the machinery of the justice system. But Weaver does not look vulnerable. He does not look afraid. He looks bored. He looks entertained. When the cameras turn toward him, he does not hide his face in shame or stare stoically at the table. He preens. He smiles. He creates a spectacle that will haunt the archives of California's juvenile justice system for decades. This is the introduction to a tragedy that began with a senseless act of violence and culminated in a display of arrogance so profound it left a seasoned judge, a grieving family, and the watching public in a state of collective disbelief. Weaver, facing the rest of his natural life behind concrete walls, looked into news cameras and famously declared that prison would be a piece of cake. He bragged that he would be out in a hot minute. He treated a murder trial like a minor inconvenience, a temporary interruption to his street life. This documentary examines the collision between a teenager's deluded sense of invincibility and the crushing, permanent reality of a life without parole sentence. It begins with the crime that stole a father from his family and the courtroom theatrics that turned a killer into a symbol of unrepentant youth. To understand the magnitude of Weaver's courtroom behavior, one must first understand the man whose life he extinguished. Robert Sartin was 52 years old, a man defined by routine, hard work, and devotion to his family. On the morning of the 16th of September, 2003, Sartin was doing what he had done countless times before. He was in the Park District of Stockton, a neighborhood that had seen better days but was still home to decent, working-class families. Sartin was an independent contractor for The Record, the local newspaper. It was early, the sun just beginning to establish the day, and Sartin was collecting monthly subscription payments from his customers. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, a familiar face who provided a service that is now largely a relic of the past. He was not a wealthy man. He was simply a man doing a job. He carried a small amount of cash, the result of his morning's collections. It was this modest sum that drew the attention of Marvel Weaver and his accomplice. Weaver, then only 16 years old, was prowling the streets, armed and looking for an opportunity. In the twisted logic of the street code Weaver subscribed to, Robert Sartin was not a human being with a history, a family, and a future. He was a target. He was a lick. The encounter was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. Weaver approached Sartin. There was no struggle that could justify the use of lethal force. No provocation that could explain the sudden escalation. It was a robbery turned execution. Weaver raised a handgun and fired. Robert Sartin fell, mortally wounded, his life ending on the pavement for a handful of cash that would ultimately amount to nothing. The violence was transactional and cold. Weaver and his accomplice fled, leaving a family shattered and a community on edge. Stockton police detectives worked the case with intensity. The randomness of the killing was terrifying. If a man could be gunned down in broad daylight for collecting paper route money, no one was safe. It did not take long for the investigation to zero in on Weaver. When he was apprehended, the detectives likely expected the typical reaction of a 16-year-old caught in a capital murder case: fear, denial, perhaps a breakdown in the interrogation room. Instead, they found a teenager who seemed completely detached from the moral gravity of his actions. He admitted to the shooting, but the confession lacked the weight of remorse. It was a recounting of events, devoid of empathy. The legal process moved forward. Because of the heinous nature of the crime, a murder committed during the commission of a robbery, prosecutors filed to try Weaver as an adult. The stakes were absolute. In California, a conviction for first-degree murder with special circumstances carried a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. For a teenager, this concept is often abstract. a mathematical impossibility that the adolescent brain struggles to comprehend. Weaver treated the proceedings not as a battle for his life, but as a stage for his ego. Throughout the pre-trial hearings and the trial itself, Weaver's behavior became the focus of intense media scrutiny. He did not act like a defendant, he acted like a celebrity. He smirked at the prosecutors. He made faces at the cameras. He postured for his friends who might be watching the news. The most chilling moments came when the victim's family was present. In the presence of Robert Sartin's grieving children and relatives, Weaver showed no humility. He did not lower his eyes. He met their grief with derision. The climax of this grotesque display occurred during the sentencing phase in July 2004. By this time, Weaver had been convicted. The jury had found him guilty of first-degree murder. The mandatory sentence was looming. The courtroom was packed. Reporters were present, sensing that this hearing would produce sound bites that would play on the evening news for weeks. They were correct. During the victim impact statements, a sacred time in the judicial process where the bereaved are given the floor to express their pain, Weaver engaged in antics that shocked even the most cynical court observers. As Robert Sartin's family members spoke about the hole left in their lives, about the grandfather who would never hold his grandchildren, about the husband who would never come home, Weaver yawned. He stretched his arms wide, feigning extreme boredom. He rolled his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He whispered to his attorney with a smirk playing on his lips. It was a calculated performance of disrespect, designed to show that he could not be touched, that their words meant nothing to him. When given the chance to speak, or when addressed by the media, Weaver doubled down. He told reporters that he wasn't worried. He projected an aura of supreme confidence. "Prison will be easy," he said, dismissing the terrors of the California Department of Corrections with a wave of his hand. He claimed he had friends on the inside, that it would be just like the neighborhood, only with walls. "I'll be out in a hot minute," he declared, suggesting that the legal system was a joke, a temporary hurdle that he would effortlessly clear. He viewed the life sentence not as a finality, but as a challenge to his street credibility, a badge of honor he was eager to wear. The judge, witnessing this behavior, was visibly disgusted. In passing sentence, the court noted Weaver's absolute lack of remorse. The judge pointed out the callousness of the crime and the defendant's subsequent behavior as proof that Weaver was a danger to society who had forfeited his right to live among free people. The sentence was pronounced life without the possibility of parole. Weaver was to die in prison. There would be no board hearings, no second chances, no release date. Weaver's reaction to the pronouncement was consistent with his performance. He smiled. He nodded, as if he had just won a prize. As bailiffs shackled him and prepared to transport him to the state reception center, Weaver looked into the cameras one last time, maintaining the facade of the hard, untouchable gangster. He was 17 years old. He had never paid a bill, never held a real job, never raised a child, and never experienced the relentless, grinding isolation of a maximum security penitentiary. He believed his own hype. He believed that the reputation he had built on the streets of Stockton would carry him through the next 60 or 70 years. The doors of the courtroom closed, sealing the prologue of Marvel Weaver's life. The cameras were turned off. The reporters filed out to write their stories about the monster in the shape of a child. The Sartin family went home to a house that would forever feel empty, carrying with them the image of their father's killer laughing in their faces. Weaver was loaded onto a transport bus, shackled hand and foot, headed for the intake center that would process him into the adult prison population. At that moment, the narrative seemed complete. Society had identified a predator and removed him. Weaver had embraced his role as the villain. The script was written in stone. He would enter the prison system, join a gang, live by the sword, and eventually die behind walls, unrepentant to the end. That is what everyone expected. That is what Weaver himself expected. But the teenage brain is not a finished product, and the reality of time is a weight that cannot be lifted by bravado. Forever is a concept that a 17-year-old cannot truly grasp until the days turn into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The adrenaline of the trial fades. The cameras move on to the next tragedy. The notoriety on the streets evaporates as new generations of youth take over the corners. What remains is a 6x8 cell, the routine of head count, and the silence of a life wasted. This documentary traces the dismantling of Marvel Weaver's arrogance. It explores what happens when the hot minute stretches into 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. It examines the slow, agonizing death of the boy who thought prison would be easy, and the emergence of a man who would eventually fall to his knees, weeping, begging for the mercy he once mocked. The journey from the smirk in 2004 to the sobbing plea for redemption is a harrowing study of crime, punishment, and the belated, crushing arrival of conscience. The story of Marvel Weaver does not end with the bang of the gavel. That was merely the beginning of the long, dark quiet. To understand the magnitude of Marvel Weaver's fall, one must first understand the height of the pedestal upon which he placed himself in 2003. Stockton, California, was not a place that coddled its youth. It was an environment where hardness was a currency, and empathy was often viewed as a liability. At 17 years old, Weaver was physically a teenager, but psychologically, he had already adopted the hardened carapace of a career criminal. He did not view the world through the lens of high school graduations or future employment. He viewed it through the sights of a firearm and the immediate gratification of street status. The build-up to the murder of Robert Sarton was not a singular explosive event, but a slow accumulation of unchecked aggression and a profound detachment from the consequences of violence. In the weeks leading up to that fateful September morning, Weaver was drifting through the city's underbelly, untethered by parental supervision or societal expectations. He moved with a sense of invincibility common among adolescents, but distorted into something lethal by the presence of a gun. To Weaver, the weapon was not just a tool for intimidation, it was an extension of his ego. It granted him power over life and death, a power he was eager to exercise. On the morning of the 16th of September 2003, the streets of Stockton were quiet. It was pre-dawn, the time of day when the city's rhythm is defined by those working the hardest to keep society functioning. 52-year-old Robert Sarton was one of those people. A dedicated family man and a hard-working citizen, Sarton was out in the darkness delivering newspapers. He was fulfilling a role that required reliability and solitude, moving from house to house in his vehicle, ensuring that the community would wake up to the day's news. He was the archetype of the innocent bystander, a man going about his lawful business, entirely disconnected from the violent subculture that Marvel Weaver inhabited. Weaver was also awake in those early hours, but his motivations were predatory. Accompanied by a female acquaintance, he was prowling the streets, looking for an opportunity. The dynamic was not one of desperation in the traditional sense. It was opportunistic and fueled by a desire to assert dominance. When Weaver spotted Sarton's vehicle, he did not see a man earning a living, he saw a target. The decision to strike was made with chilling speed. There was no hesitation, no moral debate, and no consideration for the human life inside the car. The encounter was brief and brutal. Weaver approached Sarton. The exact exchange of words, if any, mattered little in the face of the outcome. This was not a robbery gone wrong in the sense of a struggle or a panic. It was a cold-blooded execution. Weaver raised his weapon and fired. The bullet struck Sarton, ending his life almost instantly. The violence was starkly disproportionate to any potential gain. There was no vast sum of money to be stolen, no drug debt to be settled, and no personal vendetta to be resolved. Robert Sarton died simply because Marvel Weaver felt like killing him. The immediate aftermath of the shooting revealed the depth of Weaver's dissociation. Most 17-year-olds, upon realizing they had just taken a human life, would be consumed by panic, nausea, or terror. They would flee in a state of chaotic adrenaline, the reality of their actions crashing down upon them. Weaver's reaction was disturbingly different. He retreated from the scene not with the frantic energy of a child who made a mistake, but with the callous composure of someone who believed they were untouchable. The act of murder did not shatter his world. It merely fed his ego. In the days following the murder, as detectives from the Stockton Police Department pieced together the evidence, Weaver continued his life with an air of nonchalance. He did not go into hiding or show signs of psychological distress. When law enforcement finally caught up with him, his arrest did not humble him. Instead, it provided him with a new stage. The interrogation room, usually a place where bravado crumbles under the weight of potential life imprisonment, became a venue for Weaver to showcase his arrogance. He treated the investigators not as authority figures, but as adversaries in a game he believed he could win. He smirked. He gave flippant answers. He displayed a terrifying lack of empathy for Robert Sarton or the family left grieving in the wake of the murder. To Weaver, the interrogation was an annoyance, a temporary setback in his life script. He seemed unable to grasp the permanence of death or the severity of the judicial system. In his mind, he was the protagonist, and the system was just another obstacle he would eventually bypass. This attitude persisted as the case moved from the police station to the district attorney's office. The prosecutors, recognizing the heinous nature of the crime and the apparent maturity of the malice involved, made the decision to charge Weaver as an adult. This was a critical juncture. It meant that Weaver would not be shielded by the juvenile justice system, which focuses on rehabilitation and releases offenders by their 25th birthday. Instead, he was facing the full force of the California Penal Code, with penalties including life without the possibility of parole. Yet the gravity of this shift failed to penetrate Weaver's armor of arrogance. As he sat in the county jail awaiting trial, his reputation began to precede him. He wasn't the scared kid keeping his head down. He was the loud, brash inmate who treated the charges as a badge of honor. He spoke to other inmates, and eventually to the media, with a shocking level of cavalier detachment. It was during this period that the persona of the monster began to fully form in the public eye. The media coverage of the case was extensive. A 17-year-old killing a hard-working newspaper carrier was a story that resonated with the community's deepest fears about youth violence. Reporters sought to understand the why behind the crime, but Weaver gave them nothing but disdain. When cameras were trained on him, he did not hide his face in shame. He looked directly into the lens, offering smiles and glares that communicated a total lack of remorse. This behavior was not a facade put on for protection. It appeared to be his genuine internal state. He had convinced himself that the consequences were abstract. The concept of forever is difficult for any teenager to grasp, but for Weaver, it was non-existent. He operated on a timeline of immediate gratification and short-term survival. The idea of spending the rest of his natural life in a concrete box was a reality he simply refused to acknowledge. He believed he was smarter than the lawyers, tougher than the judges, and more resilient than the prison system. As the trial date approached, Weaver's conduct escalated. In pre-trial hearings, he was disruptive and disrespectful. He ignored the advice of his defense counsel, who likely tried to explain that his demeanor was destroying any chance of sympathy from a jury. Weaver didn't want sympathy, he wanted notoriety. He wanted to be seen as the hardest individual in the room. He viewed the courtroom not as a hall of justice, but as a theater where he was the star. The build-up to the trial was marked by this consistent, unwavering defiance. He mocked the legal process. He made derogatory comments about the victim. He yawned when the details of the murder were discussed. Every action he took was a slap in the face to the Sarton family, who were forced to sit in the gallery and watch the young man who murdered their loved one treat the proceedings like a joke. It was this specific period, the months between the arrest and the final sentencing, that cemented Weaver's infamy. He was cultivating the image that would later haunt him. He told reporters that prison would be a hot minute, a slang term implying a short, insignificant amount of time. He boasted that he would handle incarceration with ease, as if maximum security prison were merely a rite of passage for men of his stature. He projected an image of absolute certainty that he would return to the streets, unchanged and unbroken. The community watched in horror. They saw a young man who was not only capable of murder, but was seemingly proud of it. There was no evidence of a troubled soul seeking redemption, no tearful confessions, no apologies to the widow and children of Robert Sarton. There was only the smirk, the cold, dead-eyed smirk of a teenager who believed he was above the moral laws of humanity. This build-up set the stage for one of the most disturbing courtroom displays in Stockton's history. It created a tension that filled the courthouse, a collision course between a boy's delusional arrogance and the crushing weight of the justice system. Weaver walked into court believing he was the predator, failing to realize that he was stepping into a machine designed to neutralize threats exactly like him. He had spent his life building a reputation for fearlessness, but he had built it on a foundation of ignorance. He did not know what it meant to lose his freedom because he had never truly valued it. He did not know what it meant to face a lifetime of silence because he had never stopped talking. As the gavel was poised to fall, Marvel Weaver stood at the precipice of his own destruction, eyes wide open, yet seeing nothing. He was armored in the bravado of the streets, convinced that his youth would save him, or that his toughness would sustain him. He was about to learn that the hot minute he joked about was a myth, and that the reality awaiting him was colder and harder than any persona he could construct. The build-up was over. The long, slow descent was about to begin. The streets of Stockton, California, were cloaked in the heavy gray silence of pre-dawn on the 12th of September 2003. It was a Friday, the gateway to the weekend for the working class who populated the quiet residential neighborhoods. For 52-year-old Robert Sarton, the darkness was simply a familiar companion, a standard feature of his early morning routine. Sarton was a man of structure, a dedicated employee of Pacific Gas and Electric, who had spent decades building a life defined by reliability and steady labor. He was the antithesis of the chaotic force that was currently prowling the same streets, hunting for a target. Robert Sarton's morning began like thousands of others before it. Inside his home, the lights were low as he prepared for his shift. He was a man grounded in the community, a father and a grandfather whose life revolved around the safety and provision of his family. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew his schedule by heart. There was no premonition of danger, no sense of impending doom, only the mundane tasks of gathering keys, checking his uniform, and stepping out into the cool morning air. He walked to his vehicle, a white utility truck that served as his mobile office, parked just outside his residence. The neighborhood was asleep, the windows of surrounding houses dark, masking the reality that safety was an illusion held together only by the absence of predators. Miles away, and closing the distance rapidly, Marvel Weaver was operating on a different biological clock. At 17 years old, Weaver was not waking up for work. He had likely not slept at all. He was riding the jagged edge of an adrenaline high, fueled by a night of roaming and a growing sense of invincibility. Weaver was not alone. He was accompanied by a girlfriend, a minor whose presence did nothing to deter his violent impulses. They were navigating the streets of Stockton in a vehicle that felt less like transport and more like a shark tank, moving through the currents of the city looking for blood. Weaver was armed with a handgun, a piece of steel that gave the skinny teenager the power of a god. In his mind, the weapon was an equalizer, a tool that demanded respect and facilitated the taking of whatever he felt he was owed. The crime was not a sudden explosion of passion but a cold, calculated hunt. Weaver and his accomplice had been driving around, scanning for victims. They were looking for the vulnerable, the unaware, the easy marks. They were predators of opportunity. The psychology of the night was specific. They weren't looking for a fight, they were looking for submission. Weaver's mindset was predatory in the strictest sense. He was looking to dominate, to instill fear, and to extract value, however minimal, from whoever crossed his path. As Robert Sarton unlocked his truck and settled into the driver's seat, he became the unsuspecting focal point of Weaver's attention. The time was approximately 5:30 a.m. The sun had not yet breached the horizon. Sarton sat in his vehicle, perhaps allowing the engine to warm, perhaps arranging his gear for the day's tasks. He was in the sanctity of his own property, a space where a man feels most secure. He did not see the vehicle approaching. He did not see the teenager exiting the car, the hood of a sweatshirt pulled up, the gun gripped in a hand that had never done a hard day's work in its life. Weaver approached the truck on foot. The element of surprise was absolute. For Sarton, the transition from the mundane to the terrified was instantaneous. One moment he was alone with his thoughts. The next, a stranger was at his window, and the barrel of a gun was tapping against the glass or pointed directly at his chest. The specific verbal exchange, if there was one, was brief. In robberies of this nature, the dialogue is stripped down to primal commands. Demands for money, demands for compliance. However, the dynamics of this specific encounter suggest that Sarton barely had time to process the threat, let alone comply with it. Weaver did not act with the hesitation of a first-time offender or a scared child. He acted with the callous indifference of someone who viewed Robert Sarton not as a human being with a history, a family, and a future, but as an object, an obstacle between him and a few dollars. The robbery attempt was botched from the start, not because of resistance, but because of Weaver's trigger-happy impatience. There was no struggle for the weapon. There was no physical brawl spilling out onto the pavement. There was simply the demand, the confusion of a man ambushed in the dark, and then the deafening crack of the gunshot. The bullet tore through the quiet morning, shattering the stillness. Weaver fired the weapon at close range. The physics of the violence were brutal and final. The projectile struck Robert Sarton, inflicting a catastrophic injury that rendered any medical intervention moot. The 52-year-old slumped in the seat of his truck, his life draining away on the upholstery of the vehicle he drove to earn an honest living. He died confused, terrified, and alone, just steps from the front door where his family slept. The aftermath of the shot was not panic but flight. Weaver did not check on his victim. He did not recoil in horror at what he had done. He simply turned and walked back to his waiting vehicle. The callousness of the exit was as chilling as the act itself. To Weaver, the transaction was complete, even if it yielded no profit. He had exerted power. He had taken a life. He climbed back into the car, and the engine roared as they sped away, leaving the white truck idling in the driveway with a dying man inside. The immediate silence that followed the gunshot was heavy. In the surrounding houses, the noise might have registered as a car backfiring or a distant firecracker, noises easily dismissed by sleepers wanting to stay in their dreams. But as the minutes ticked by, the reality of the scene began to solidify. The sun eventually began to rise, casting light on the tragedy. Robert Sarton was discovered, not by police responding to an immediate call, but by the horrific realization that he had not left for work. The discovery of the body shattered the peace of the neighborhood. The white truck became a crime scene, taped off with yellow plastic that fluttered in the morning breeze. Police arrived to find a scene devoid of the perpetrator, but rich in forensic sorrow. The investigation began with the standard protocols. Technicians combed the driveway for shell casings, footprints, any physical debris that might link a suspect to the murder. They photographed the angle of the truck, the shattered window, the position of the victim. It was a puzzle with a missing piece, a violent subtraction from the community. The detectives looked at the life of Robert Sarton and found no enemies, no debts, no shadow life that would invite a hit. He was exactly what he appeared to be, an innocent man in the wrong place at the wrong time. This randomness was the most terrifying aspect of the crime. It wasn't a crime of passion involving a lover, nor a drug deal gone wrong. It was a random selection. The investigators realized they were looking for a rover, someone mobile and violent. Reports began to filter in regarding other incidents in the area: attempted robberies, shots fired, aggressive behavior. A pattern emerged of a spree, a jagged line of violence cutting through Stockton, with Robert Sarton's murder as its tragic zenith. Weaver's movements after the shooting were indicative of his state of mind. There was no hiding in a basement, shivering with guilt. He continued his existence with a terrifying normalcy. He disposed of the evidence or hid it, confident in his ability to outsmart the system. The gun, the instrument of Sarton's death, was the only link, and Weaver held on to the belief that he was untouchable. He moved through the days following the murder with the swagger of someone who believed they had gotten away with the ultimate transgression. The investigation quickly pivoted from a whodunit to a manhunt as witnesses and ballistic evidence began to coalesce. The description of the car, the timeline of the spree, and word on the street pointed toward the 17-year-old. When the net tightened, it wasn't because Weaver surrendered. It was because the forensic trail led straight to him. The police connected the dots between the shell casing found at the scene and the weapon associated with Weaver. When the arrest finally came, it brought the two worlds into collision. The grieving family of Robert Sartin, who were preparing for a funeral they never should have had to plan, and Marvel Weaver, who was being processed into a system he claimed to not fear. The interrogation room offered a glimpse into the void behind the crime. Weaver did not break down. He did not offer tears for the man he had killed. He treated the murder of Robert Sartin as a footnote in his own biography, an inconvenience. He described the events with a detachment that chilled the seasoned detective sitting across from him. There was no explanation for why he pulled the trigger other than he wanted to, or he felt like it, or the money wasn't coming fast enough. The banality of the motive stood in stark contrast to the magnitude of the loss. Robert Sartin's death was the result of a collision between a man building a future and a boy intent on destroying one. The physical act of the murder took less than 3 seconds the time it takes to raise a hand and squeeze a finger. But those 3 seconds rippled outward, destroying a family and setting the stage for a courtroom drama that would shock the nation. Weaver's actions in that driveway were the raw material of the case. Everything that followed the smirks, the taunts, the shocking arrogance was merely the public manifestation of the same soullessness he displayed in the dark at 5:30 a.m. The crime was complete, the victim was gone, and the killer sat in a cell, waiting to tell the world that he didn't care. The silence of the pre-dawn hours in Stockton was shattered not by the gunshot itself, which was a sharp, singular crack that dissipated instantly into the atmosphere, but by the chaotic aftermath that followed. At 4:32 a.m., the dispatch center received a frantic call. The voice on the other end was hysterical, breathless, and broken by sobbing. It was Robert Sartin's companion, the woman who had been sitting just inches away from him when his life was extinguished. Her pleas for help set the emergency response apparatus in motion, transforming a quiet residential street into a sterile theater of forensic analysis. Patrol units were the first to arrive, their strobe lights cutting through the darkness and painting the suburban lawns in alternating flashes of red and blue. They found Robert Sartin's vehicle idling near the curb, the driver's side door slightly ajar. Inside, the reality of the crime was immediate and irreversible. Sartin was slumped over, unresponsive, having sustained a fatal gunshot wound. The officers immediately established a perimeter, stretching yellow tape across the roadway to preserve the integrity of the scene. The priority shifted instantly from rescue to containment. Paramedics confirmed the death upon arrival, noting the catastrophic nature of the injury which precluded any resuscitative efforts. Stockton Police Department homicide detectives were roused from their beds and summoned to the location. Upon their arrival, the sun had not yet risen, leaving the crime scene illuminated by the artificial glare of portable floodlights. The investigation began with a methodical grid search of the asphalt. Crime scene technicians, dressed in protective Tyvek suits, scoured the ground for the physical debris of violence. Their focus was singular, the shell casing. In shooting cases, the casing is the mechanical fingerprint of the weapon, a piece of brass that can link a specific gun to a specific moment in time. Near the driver's side of the vehicle, illuminated by a technician's flashlight, lay the spent cartridge. It was photographed in situ, measured, and carefully bagged. This small piece of metal was the first objective truth in a case that would soon become defined by the suspect's subjective arrogance. The trajectory analysis suggested the shooter had been standing at close range, firing downward into the vehicle. The lack of struggle indicated the element of surprise. Sartin had likely been approached before he could register the threat or engage the transmission of his car to flee. While forensics processed the physical scene, detectives turned their attention to the human element. The witness, traumatized and shivering in the morning chill, provided the initial narrative framework. She described a young male appearing out of the darkness. There was no complex negotiation, no extended dialogue, just a demand, a hesitation, and a shot. Her description of the assailant was generic enough to fit hundreds of individuals in the city. but she provided crucial details about his demeanor and his method of approach. It was a robbery, she insisted. He wanted money. When the money did not materialize instantly, he fired. This was not a crime of passion or a targeted assassination. It was a crime of opportunity and impatience. The investigation moved outward from the epicenter of the shooting. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, waking residents to ask if they had seen a vehicle speeding away or heard voices prior to the shot. In 2003, the ubiquity of doorbell cameras and high-definition surveillance was non-existent, meaning the police had to rely on old-fashioned leather-shoe detective work. They looked for fresh tire marks that didn't belong to the residents. They checked for discarded items in nearby trash cans or bushes, looking for anything the shooter might have dropped in flight. The breakthrough in identifying Marvel Weaver did not come from a single dramatic clue, but rather from the aggregation of street intelligence and rapid police work. In the hours following the murder, word on the street moved faster than official channels. The description of the suspect and the nature of the crime, a botched robbery in the early morning, filtered through the community. Police focus narrowed on known juvenile offenders operating in the area who had a history of robberies or weapons possession. Weaver, a 17-year-old with a developing reputation, surfaced as a person of interest. Locating Weaver required a coordinated effort between the Homicide Bureau and gang suppression units. The dragnet tightened quickly. Unlike a seasoned career criminal who might have had the resources to flee the jurisdiction or the foresight to destroy all evidence immediately, Weaver was still in Stockton. When officers eventually located him, the apprehension was tense but procedurally standard. He was taken into custody, separated from the environment that emboldened him, and transported to the police headquarters for processing. The transition from the streets to the sterile environment of the interrogation room often induces a psychological shift in suspects, but the investigation into Weaver revealed a disturbing anomaly. As detectives prepared the case file, they began to catalog not just the physical evidence, but the behavioral evidence. During the booking process, as his fingerprints were rolled onto the ink pad and his mugshot was taken, officers noted a distinct lack of anxiety. Most juveniles facing a murder charge exhibit signs of panic, tears, or withdrawal. Weaver exhibited boredom. This demeanor became a central component of the investigation. It forced the detectives to ensure every procedural step was unassailable. If the suspect was this detached, he would likely not offer a tearful confession or lead them to the weapon out of guilt. The case had to be built on hard evidence. A search warrant was executed to recover the firearm. The recovery of the weapon was paramount. Without it, the defense could argue mistaken identity. The gun was located and sent immediately to the ballistics lab. In the quiet precision of the laboratory, experts test-fired the weapon into a water tank to retrieve an undamaged bullet and a fresh casing. Under the comparison microscope, the striations, the microscopic scratches left on the bullet by the barrel's rifling, were compared to the casing found next to Robert Sartin's car. The match was conclusive. The firing pin impression on the primer was identical. The extractor marks lined up perfectly. Science had bridged the gap between the 17-year-old in custody and the 52-year-old victim. Simultaneously, detectives worked to verify the timeline. They pulled phone records and interviewed associates to construct a minute-by-minute account of Weaver's movements prior to 4:30 a.m. They discovered a pattern of aimlessness. Weaver and his associates had been roaming, looking for a target. The selection of Robert Sartin was entirely random. He happened to be there, awake and vulnerable. At the exact moment, Weaver decided to escalate his criminal ambitions. This randomness made the crime harder for the community to process. There was no logic to avoid, no precaution that could have saved Sartin. It was a lightning strike of violence. The investigation also focused on corroborating the witness's identification. A photo lineup was constructed. The method was strictly controlled to avoid leading the witness. 6 photographs, all showing young men with similar physical characteristics, were placed before the grieving woman. She identified Weaver. The identification, combined with the ballistics match and Weaver's own admissions, solidified the case. The whodunit aspect of the investigation was resolved within days, a testament to the efficiency of the Stockton police, but the why remained a hollow void. As the detectives compiled the final report for the district attorney's office, the magnitude of the evidence was overwhelming. They had the shooter, the weapon, the witness, and the confession. Yet, the file they handed over described a perpetrator who seemed utterly disconnected from the gravity of the situation. The investigative notes highlighted Weaver's cavalier attitude during transport and processing. He treated the murder charge as a temporary inconvenience rather than a life-altering catastrophe. The investigative phase concluded not with a dramatic chase, but with the bureaucratic thud of a heavy file landing on a prosecutor's desk. The police had done their job. They had taken a chaotic scene of death and distilled it into a sequence of verifiable facts. They had stripped Marvell Weaver of his anonymity and assigned him a booking number. The investigation had answered the questions of who, when, where, and how. It had uncovered the gun and matched the bullets. But as the detectives stepped back to let the judicial process take over, the chilling reality of their findings lingered. They had caught a killer who looked at the prospect of life in prison and shrugged. The evidence was locked away, the crime scene tape was removed, and the street where Robert Sarton died returned to its quiet routine, leaving the legal system to deal with a defendant who believed he was untouchable. San Joaquin County prosecutors stared down a mountain of evidence that made the prospect of a plea bargain virtually obsolete. The case against Marvell Weaver was not built on circumstantial whispers or ambiguous timelines. It was constructed from the hard, immutable physics of a crime scene that left little room for doubt. The investigation had moved rapidly from the chaotic initial response to the sterile, quiet work of the forensics laboratory, where the final moments of Robert Sarton's life were reconstructed with mathematical precision. At the center of the prosecution's case lay the weapon. In many homicide investigations, the firearm disappears into a river or a dumpster, leaving investigators to rely on striations on a bullet without a gun to match them to. In the Weaver case, the recovery of the weapon provided the mechanical link necessary to seal the timeline. Ballistics experts analyzed the handgun recovered in connection with the arrest. They test-fired rounds into water tanks, retrieving the pristine projectiles to compare against the fragmented lead recovered from the victim. Under the comparison microscope, the story was told in ridges and grooves. The lands and grooves inside the barrel of the gun had imparted a unique signature onto the bullet, a fingerprint in steel and lead that was as distinct as the whorls on a human thumb. The match was conclusive. The bullet that killed Robert Sarton had undoubtedly passed through the barrel of the gun linked directly to Marvell Weaver. This forensic certainty was bolstered by the trajectory analysis. Crime scene technicians had scoured the location where Sarton's vehicle had come to rest. They mapped the blood spatter and the position of the body to determine the exact angle of the shot. The geometry of the murder was simple and brutal. The shooter had not fired from a distance or in a panic-induced spray of bullets. The evidence suggested a proximity that spoke of intent. The angle of entry was consistent with someone standing immediately outside the driver's side, demanding compliance and firing when that compliance was not instantaneous. This spatial reconstruction dismantled any potential defense claims of an accidental discharge or a warning shot gone wrong. The evidence showed that the gun was pointed directly at a vital area of the victim's body at close range. While the physical evidence provided the how, the testimonial evidence provided the who. Robert Sarton had not been alone. The presence of a witness, Sarton's girlfriend, transformed the abstract legal proceedings into a confrontation with human memory. She had sat in the passenger seat, a terrifyingly close observer to the execution of her partner. Her account to the detectives was harrowing in its clarity. She described the sudden onset of violence, the demand for money, and the shocking swiftness of the gunshot. Witness identification is often attacked by defense attorneys as unreliable, subject to the warping effects of trauma and poor lighting. However, the prosecution fortified this eyewitness account with the corroborating statements of the other individuals present at the scene. Weaver had not been a lone wolf. He was part of a group of teenagers roaming Stockton that night, looking for easy targets. The police leveraged the classic prisoner's dilemma. Separated and questioned, the cohesion of the group disintegrated. The accomplices, facing the terrifying reality of being accessories to murder, began to talk. Their statements created a narrative mesh that trapped Weaver. They detailed the events leading up to the shooting, describing the group's intent to commit robbery. Crucially, they identified Weaver as the aggressor, the one who escalated a theft into a homicide. These statements were not merely finger-pointing. They contained details about the night, the route they took, the clothes they wore. The conversation before and after that matched the physical evidence and the independent witness accounts. The consistency across multiple interviews with different suspects gave the prosecution a panoramic view of the night. It wasn't just one person saying Weaver pulled the trigger. It was a chorus of voices, including those who had been his friends, placing the weapon in his hand. The investigation also delved into the forensic biology of the scene. In the struggle and the close-quarters nature of the carjacking attempt, the transfer of trace evidence is almost inevitable. Investigators combed the victim's vehicle for prints and DNA. Every smudge on the door handle, every fiber on the upholstery was cataloged. The goal was to place Weaver not just in the vicinity, but in contact with the crime scene. The science of touch meant that Weaver's presence was recorded in oil and sweat, chemically developed and lifted by technicians to be compared against the booking prints taken after his arrest. The physical link between the perpetrator and the victim's car served to anchor the testimonial evidence in physical reality. Beyond the gun, the fingerprints, and the witnesses, there was the evidence of Weaver's own conduct. In modern criminal prosecutions, the behavior of the suspect post-offense is frequently utilized to demonstrate a consciousness of guilt. Weaver did not turn himself in. He did not call for help. The investigation documented his movements after the shooting, tracking a pattern of flight and evasion. This timeline of avoidance was critical. It demonstrated that Weaver understood the gravity of what he had done and sought to escape the consequences. A jury is often instructed that flight can be interpreted as an admission of guilt, and the detectives meticulously mapped out his attempts to hide. Furthermore, the interrogation room tapes became a piece of evidence in their own right. While Weaver would later become infamous for his courtroom outbursts, the seeds of that behavior were evident in the transcripts and recordings of his initial interviews. Detectives looking for signs of remorse or accidental panic found neither. Instead, they documented a demeanor that was detached, almost bored. This psychological evidence, while not as tangible as a bullet casing, was devastating. It painted a portrait of a defendant who lacked the capacity for empathy, a factor that would later weigh heavily during the sentencing phase. The prosecutors prepared to show that Weaver's reaction to being told he had killed a man was not a breakdown of sorrow, but a calculation of how it affected his own freedom. The file also contained the autopsy report, a document of clinical horror that stood in stark contrast to Weaver's dismissal of the event. The medical examiner's findings were precise. They detailed the catastrophic damage caused by the single bullet. This medical evidence was prepared for presentation not to shock, but to prove the lethality of the assault. It countered any narrative that the injury was intended to be minor. The path of the bullet through vital structures was a physiological testament to the intent to kill. The prosecution prepared diagrams and photographs, translating the medical jargon into a visual presentation that would force the court to confront the reality of the violence. Financial records and background checks on the victim, Robert Sarton, were also included to establish the context of the robbery. These documents proved that Sarton was an innocent victim, a man simply going about his life, chosen at random. This lack of prior relationship between victim and killer removed any complexity of motive. There was no feud, no debt, no provocation. The evidence showed purely predatory behavior. Weaver did not know Sarton. He only knew that Sarton had a car and potentially money. The senselessness of the crime, supported by the lack of any connection between the two parties, reinforced the prosecution's narrative of a cold-blooded robbery gone wrong. As the pre-trial phase neared its end, the district attorney's office reviewed the accumulation of facts. They had the murder weapon, and they could prove Weaver held it. They had the bullet that killed Sarton, and they could prove it came from that gun. They had an eyewitness who saw Weaver shoot. They had accomplices who confirmed Weaver shot. They had the flight, the forensics, and the utter lack of a valid alibi. The defense had virtually no room to maneuver. There were no murky shadows where a reasonable doubt could hide. The puzzle was complete, and every piece had been pressed firmly into place. This overwhelming stricture of evidence created a specific psychological pressure cooker for the defendant. In many cases, a defendant facing such odds might seek a plea to avoid the maximum penalty. However, the evidence here was so damning, and the crime so violent, that the district attorney was seeking the maximum punishment available under the law. The strength of the case ironically left Weaver with few options. He could not argue he wasn't there. He could not argue someone else did it. The facts were cemented in lab reports and sworn statements. The preparation of the exhibits for trial signaled the end of the investigative chapter. The gun was tagged and bagged, ready to be shown to a jury. The charts of the crime scene were printed on large boards. The 911 calls were transcribed. The prosecution was ready to present a narrative that was not a story, but a reenactment of truth supported by science. The detectives who had worked the case stepped back, their role transitioning from hunters to witnesses. They had gathered the materials necessary to lock Marvell Weaver away. The sheer weight of this file, the absolute certainty of the conclusions it contained, likely contributed to the nihilistic attitude Weaver would soon display. Confronted with a reality he could not talk his way out of, and evidence he could not refute, he seemingly decided to reject the validity of the process itself. The evidence proved he was a killer. His reaction to that proof would soon demonstrate to the world exactly what kind of killer he was. The stage was set not for a mystery, but for a judgment. The silence of the evidence locker was about to be replaced by the noise of the courtroom. The sheer weight of this file, the absolute certainty of the conclusions it contained, likely contributed to the defense counsel's inability to construct a plausible alternative theory for the events of that July morning. With the forensic evidence locking the timeline in place and the eyewitness accounts corroborating the sequence of the shooting, Marvell Weaver's attorneys were left with few strategic avenues. They could not argue mistaken identity, nor could they plausibly claim self-defense given that Robert Sarton had been unarmed and ambushed in his own vehicle. The legal strategy therefore did not focus on exoneration but rather on the mitigation of the inevitable penalty. However, the defendant himself seemed intent on sabotaging even that limited objective. As the trial commenced in the San Joaquin County Superior Court, the atmosphere was charged not with the suspense of a whodunit, but with the palpable tension created by Weaver's demeanor. In a courtroom designed for solemnity, where a family grieved the loss of a father and husband, Weaver treated the proceedings with a casual disdain that bordered on performance art. He did not sit with the hung head of a remorseful youth or the terrified posture of a teenager facing life in prison. Instead, he slouched, smirked, and engaged in theatrics that alienated the very jury holding his fate in their hands. The prosecution moved methodically through the charges. First, degree murder, with special circumstances, specifically murder committed during the commission of an attempted robbery. They also attached enhancements for the personal use of a firearm. Witness after witness took the stand to point an accusatory finger at Weaver, and with each identification, the 17-year-old's defiance seemed to grow. He glared at witnesses and made audible comments, seemingly treating the trial as an extension of his street reputation rather than a legal proceeding that would determine the rest of his life. The jury's deliberation was swift. The evidence was insurmountable, and Weaver's behavior had stripped away any potential sympathy that might have been afforded to him due to his age. The verdict was returned, guilty on all counts. The finding of special circumstances made Weaver eligible for the harshest penalty available to a minor at the time, life without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that meant exactly what it said: he would die in prison. Following the conviction, but prior to the formal sentencing, the probation department and court-appointed psychologists conducted their evaluations. Their reports painted a picture of a young man completely detached from the gravity of his actions. One report described him as having a profound lack of empathy. But the most damaging testimony to his character came from Weaver himself. During a jailhouse interview with a local reporter, a segment that would later be broadcast and archived as a testament to his hubris, Weaver dismissed the consequences of his actions with chilling nonchalance. When asked about the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars, Weaver looked directly into the camera, a smirk playing on his lips. He told the reporter that prison would be easy. He described it as nothing more than 3 meals a day and a place to sleep, equating a maximum security penitentiary with a carefree existence. He famously boasted that he would be out in a hot minute, implying that the legal system was a joke and that his incarceration was merely a temporary inconvenience. This interview, broadcast to the community of Stockton, solidified the public's perception of him as a predator beyond redemption. The sentencing hearing in 2004 became the stage for the final act of this tragedy's first chapter. The courtroom was packed. Robert Sarton's family was present to deliver victim impact statements, a right afforded to them to express the depth of their loss. As the victim's daughter stood to speak, fighting through tears to describe the void left by her father's murder, the courtroom's attention shifted to the defense table. Weaver was yawning. He stretched his arms, looked around the room with bored indifference, and at one point rolled his eyes at the family's grief. Judge Leslie Holland, presiding over the case, observed this behavior with a stony expression. When it was time to pronounce the sentence, the judge did not mince words. He noted Weaver's absolute lack of remorse, citing the yawning and the media interview as clear indicators of a sociopathic detachment. Judge Holland sentenced Marvel Weaver to life without the possibility of parole. There would be no review, no parole board hearings, and no release. The hot minute Weaver had predicted had turned into an eternity. As he was led away in shackles, he maintained his swagger, looking back at the gallery with one last expression of defiance. Weaver was processed into the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He was no longer a juvenile in a detention hall. He was a convicted murderer in the adult prison system. The reality of his boast began to collapse almost immediately. Easy was not the word for the violence, the isolation, and the regimented deprivation of maximum security confinement. The years began to grind forward. 1 year turned into 5. The swagger evaporated, replaced by the survival instincts necessary to navigate a world of concrete and steel. The notoriety he had enjoyed as the cocky teenager faded, leaving him as just another number among thousands. While Weaver sat in his cell, the legal landscape regarding juvenile offenders began to shift beneath the prison walls. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Court, Alabama, that mandatory sentences of life without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional, constituting cruel and unusual punishment. This ruling was retroactive. California subsequently passed Senate Bill 9 and later Senate Bill 260, creating a mechanism for juvenile offenders sentenced to life terms to petition the court for a resentencing hearing. This legislation offered a sliver of light in a previously sealed tunnel. It offered a chance, not a guarantee for a second look. It took years for the legal machinery to process these changes and for Weaver's case to come back up the docket. By the time he returned to the San Joaquin County Superior Court for his resentencing hearing, nearly a decade and a half had passed since the murder of Robert Sarton. The man who walked into the courtroom bore little resemblance to the teenager who had yawned at the victim's family. He was older, his head shaved, wearing thick-rimmed glasses, and his posture was one of submission rather than aggression. The burden was now on Weaver to prove that he was not the irredeemable, corrupt individual the original sentence implied, but rather a child whose crime reflected transient immaturity. The prosecution argued vehemently against any reduction. They played the tapes of his 2004 interview. They read the transcripts of his taunts. They reminded the court of the callousness of the execution-style killing. To the district attorney, the brutality of the crime and the arrogance of the aftermath were inextricably linked, warranting the continued protection of society by keeping Weaver locked away forever. Then, it was Weaver's turn to speak. The transformation was jarring. Standing before the judge and, more importantly, before the Sarton family who had gathered once again, the defiance was gone. Weaver began to weep. He did not blame his environment, his upbringing, or the system. He spoke directly to the pain he had caused. He admitted that as a teenager, he had been trying to impress older peers, trying to be a hard individual, and that he had been too stupid and cruel to understand the finality of death. He turned to the Sarton family. The arrogance of the hot-minute comment was replaced by a desperate plea for forgiveness. He acknowledged that he had taken a good man from them, a man who was just trying to go to work. "I am sorry," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "I know words can't fix it. I was a child who thought he knew everything, but I knew nothing." He told the court that the reality of prison was a nightmare, that he had spent years in regret, and that he was begging for a chance to one day prove he could be a human being outside of a cage. He did not demand release. He begged for mercy. The courtroom was silent. The juxtaposition of the smirking killer from 2004 and the broken, weeping man of the present was profound. It forced the court to grapple with the very difficult question posed by the new laws. Is a person defined forever by their worst act committed as a minor? The judge weighed the testimony carefully. The psychological reports now showed a man who had matured, who had avoided gang politics in prison for several years, and who had pursued his GED. However, the gravity of the crime remained unchanged. Robert Sarton was still dead. The trauma inflicted on his family was permanent. In the final ruling, the court acknowledged Weaver's remorse. The judge noted that the arrogance of youth had clearly dissipated, replaced by the crushing reality of consequences. However, the court also had to weigh public safety and the interests of justice. The outcome was a resentencing that removed the without parole designation, but did not grant immediate freedom. Weaver was resentenced to a term of 25 years to life. This meant that, legally, he was no longer condemned to die in prison automatically. He would eventually be eligible to go before a parole board. The victory for Weaver was Pyrrhic. In the short term, he was returned to his cell, not released to the streets. He would still spend the prime of his life incarcerated. But the legal outcome signified a monumental shift. The hot minute he had once bragged about had turned into decades of hard time, stripping him of his ego and leaving him at the mercy of the very system he had once mocked. The boy who thought prison would be easy had been obliterated by the man who now understood that freedom was a privilege he had violently forfeited, one he would have to spend the rest of his life begging to regain. The ink on the resentencing order dried, but the heavy steel doors of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation did not swing open. Marvell Weaver, no longer a teenager with a smirk but a man approaching middle age, was returned to the general population to continue a routine that had defined his entire adult existence. The resentencing to 25 years to life was a judicial milestone, a correction of a sentence deemed unconstitutional by evolving standards of decency, yet it did not erase the history that necessitated it. The legacy of the case of Marvell Weaver and Robert Sarton is not merely a legal footnote regarding juvenile offender laws. It is a profound, enduring testament to the catastrophic impact of senseless violence and the indelible stain of arrogance. For the family of Robert Sarton, the legacy of the case is static and painful. Unlike the legal system, which allows for amendments, appeals, and retroactive considerations, the loss of a father and husband is permanent. Robert Sarton remains frozen in time, a 52-year-old man who woke up one morning in 2003 to go to work and never returned. His legacy is that of an innocent victim, a Pacific Gas and Electric employee gunned down in a moment of arbitrary cruelty. While the courts debated the development of the adolescent brain and the capacity for rehabilitation, the Sarton family was forced to relive the trauma. Every hearing, every motion, and every headline served as a resurrection of the day their lives were shattered. The possibility of Weaver's eventual release introduced a complex layer to their grief. The justice they believed was finalized in 2004. A sentence that ensured the killer would never walk free had been dismantled by legislative shifts. For the victims, The legacy of the legal system's evolution feels less like progress and more like a betrayal, a signal that the suffering of the living and the memory of the dead can be outweighed by the potential redemption of the perpetrator. Weaver's personal legacy is inextricably anxious, bound to the very words he spoke when he was 17. The videotapes of his initial court appearances remain some of the most chilling documents in the archives of San Joaquin County. In the digital age, those clips have garnered millions of views, immortalizing the image of a callous youth yawning in the face of a grieving family. That footage is the albatross around his neck. It is the first thing any parole board commissioner will review, and it is the image the public retains. No matter how many certificates of rehabilitation he earns, no matter how many years he spends devoid of disciplinary infractions, the ghost of the boy who said, "Prison will be easy," haunts the man who now knows it is anything but. His legacy is a cautionary tale about the permanence of digital infamy and the crushing weight of recorded hubris. He became the face of the argument against juvenile leniency, the example prosecutors point to when they argue that some individuals are simply wired for remorselessness. Overturning that narrative is the monumental task that defines the remainder of his incarceration. The transition from a sentence of life without parole to a sentence with the possibility of parole fundamentally altered the psychology of his confinement. Under the original sentence, behavior was a matter of survival. Under the new sentence, behavior is a matter of strategy and genuine transformation. Weaver must now prove a negative, that he is no longer the monster he proudly claimed to be. This requires more than just following rules. It demands a deconstruction of the self that existed in 2003. He has to demonstrate to a skeptical board that the arrogant teenager died in that cell years ago, replaced by a man capable of empathy. The burden of proof is immense. He is fighting against his own mythology, trying to convince the world that the hot minute he joked about was actually a lifetime of regret. The broader societal legacy of the Weaver case lies in its role as a stress test for California's criminal justice reforms. The case sits at the uncomfortable intersection of punishment and rehabilitation. Senate Bill 260 and subsequent laws were designed based on the scientific consensus that juvenile brains are not fully formed, that impulse control and consequential thinking are undeveloped, and that a child should not be discarded for their worst actions. Weaver is the test subject for this philosophy. If a teenager who killed an innocent man and mocked the family can truly be rehabilitated, then the system works as intended. If he cannot, or if his release leads to further harm, the experiment fails. The case challenges the public to reconcile the brutality of the crime with the capacity for human change. It forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that justice is not a monolith. It is fluid, shifting with the political and scientific tides. Inside the prison walls, Weaver's legacy has shifted from that of a notorious tough guy to that of an elder inmate. In the hierarchy of the yard, the lifers often become the stabilizers, the men who have accepted their fate and urge younger inmates to avoid the mistakes they made. Weaver, now decades removed from the streets of Stockton, occupies a space where he must mentor others to prevent them from becoming him. This is a paradoxical legacy, using his own wasted youth as a curriculum for others. He has spent more time in a cage than he ever spent in society. His understanding of the world is filtered through the lens of corrections. The easy time he predicted turned into a grind of isolation, violence, and monotony that eroded the bravado of his youth. The man who stands before the board in future hearings will bear the physical and emotional scars of the system he once dismissed. The legacy of the crime also extends to the community of Stockton. The murder of Robert Sarton was a touchstone event, a reminder of the random violence that can pierce the veil of suburban safety. It contributed to a hardening of local attitudes toward youth crime, fueling the tough-on-crime policies of the early 2000s that are now being dismantled. The cycle of violence that produced Marvell Weaver, a background of instability and gang influence, remains a persistent issue. The case serves as a grim historical marker for the city, a reference point for discussions about gang injunctions, youth outreach, and the socioeconomic factors that manufacture teenage killers. As the years move forward and Weaver approaches his initial parole eligibility dates, the tension between the past and the future tightens. The hot minute has stretched into thousands of days and nights. The legacy of his arrogance has been paid for in lost time, a currency that can never be refunded. When he eventually sits across from the commissioners, the file in front of them will contain the letters from the Sarton family, detailing the weddings Robert missed, the grandchildren he never held, and the void that never filled. It will also contain the transcript of Weaver's taunts. To be granted parole, Weaver will have to thread a needle through the eye of a hurricane. He will have to acknowledge that the 17-year-old version of himself was, in effect, a sociopath, while convincing the state that the current version is a contributing member of society. The ultimate legacy of this tragedy is the silence that follows the noise. The noise of the gunshots, the noise of the courtroom outbursts, the noise of the media frenzy, all of it eventually fades into the silence of a life serving time and a life lost too soon. Robert Sarton's legacy is preserved in the memories of those who loved him, a virtuous life cut short. Marvel Weaver's legacy is still being written, etched into the concrete of a prison cell. He is the living embodiment of the consequence of arrogance. He proved himself wrong in the most devastating way possible. Prison was not easy. It broke him, reshaped him, and forced him to beg for the mercy he once spat upon. Whether he dies behind bars or walks out as an old man, the story remains a tragedy with no winners, only a long, painful shadow cast by a few seconds of violence on a morning in 2003. The arrogance of youth was fleeting. The wreckage it caused is eternal.